How to learn anything. Did you ever want to learn something, but you just couldn't find a teacher for it? Or maybe the technology for what you wanted to learn just wasn't quite there. Well, let me tell you a story about how you can in fact learn anything. You see, as it turns out, meditatively speaking, anything that you could possibly want to learn how to do already exists. And this is an interesting trick involving meditation, and it's not so outlandish as you would think. Perhaps some of you have heard of a guy named Einstein. He has an interesting backstory in that here he was in the early 1900s working as a patent clerk because he couldn't find a job in academia as a physicist. Now this is the common story behind how this goes on. However, there's a little bit about this that tends to get left out. One, as it turns out, there were plenty of Jews in academia at the time. So maybe Einstein just wasn't that good. But he gives us a little bit of a clue. Have you ever heard of the clock on bus scenario? Well, as it turns out, Einstein, patent clerk, scrub physicist, was sitting on a bus when he looked up at a clock. When he looked up at the hands of the clock stopped in time and time was suspended. And at this point in time, all of the knowledge of the theory of relativity got downloaded into his brain. Sounds pretty interesting, doesn't it? Well, as it turns out, this is a well-understood mechanism in esoterica known as an information download. So, how can you get access to one of these things? Well, as it turns out, there was a book written called The Practice of Magical Evocation. In this book was contained a list of 360 schools, all of which were available through the meditative process. Now, this meditative process is, again, how you get access to these schools. It's basically done through a kind of out-of-body projection. So, how does this work? Well, basically, you develop some background level skill in something, and then you develop that to the point where you can make contact with one of the intelligences mentioned in these 360 schools. And let me be clear, these schools cover every possible human endeavor that you could be interested in. Everything from leatherworking, to engineering, to science, to business, to acting, to writing, you name it. So, why do you need to know a little bit about something? Shouldn't you just be able to project your mind into these places, make contact with the entities, and go from there? Well, as it turns out, entities largely communicate with human beings through a process of reflection. So you have to know a little something about what you're dealing with, or there's nothing to reflect off of. So let me start with an interesting interlude. A friend of mine and a teacher wanted to become a master of hydrology. Okay, fair enough. Don't know why they wanted to do this, but they did. Okay. So they went out and they worked all the possible rituals associated with hydrology, what you would need to do, contact the appropriate spirit, so on and so forth. Well, as it turns out, the spirit was kind of hard to reach. Didn't really want to talk to my friend. But he was very persistent, so he kept on going. So, at the end of the day, he had a final vision, and this was very unusual in that there were written letters that he could actually read in this vision. So in this vision, he sees a long, low plain, filled with young people and low buildings in the distance. And then he sees a scroll come up in front of his eyes, and it unrolls. And this scroll has 3 letters on it. The letters P, H, and D. So basically what the spirit was telling him was he didn't know enough about the topic involved for them to have a conversation. And before this sounds too outlandish, keep in mind the following. Imagine what would happen if you wandered into the back hallways of a major university. I'm talking Ivy Leagues, real PhDs, high-level researchers. And you just wandered around knocking on doors until someone opened a door and agreed to talk to you. If you didn't have a lot of knowledge in whatever that person's subject matter was, what kind of conversation would you really had? What kind of conversation could you have? Or maybe the professor would just send you packing, telling you to get the hell out of there, and then call security with a reminder to keep the riffraff off the streets from getting into where real people are doing real work. There's no difference here. So let's go back to our Einstein example. So you take a guy who can't even get a job doing physics because he probably isn't that good, who wakes up one morning and becomes the modern god emperor of physics. Well, that sounds an awful lot like an information download. So, all right, what are the mechanics required to do this? Well, as has already been mentioned, first of all, you need to know something about the subject matter. And again, the more you know, the better off you're going to be. So this is where having what we call friends or mentors or teachers in the real world becomes very helpful. So you need to go out and find some of those and develop a certain base level of skill regarding whatever your subject matter is. Doesn't even matter. Then you need to find the appropriate school amongst the 360 Earth heads, and you need to do an invocation into that sphere of knowledge. All right, sounds good in theory. What's actually required to do this? All right, first of all, you're going to need to have some degree of out-of-body projection. Again, in the school that I'm working with, this is referred to as mental wandering. Some schools refer to this as astral projection. The difference between the two is something that is a rather long discussion, but at the end of the day, you need some ability to take your consciousness and move it from the here and now to another place. Okay, that's step one. Step two. You need to have adequately developed clairvoyance and clairaudience so that you can communicate with the entity in question. Okay, so that's going to take some development as well. If you have those two things, that's a good start. There is, however, a third thing that I would highly advise your having, and that is control of your own Akasha, or the power of the void. Now, you want this because this allows you to control the flow of the information from the entity. So if you run into an entity that's not particularly receptive or maybe has a negative nature, you can simply tell them to go away. That way they're not hanging around in the background for the rest of your life, harassing you about one thing or another. Okay, so you have the ability to go there. You have the ability to communicate through clairvoyance and clairaudience. You have some basic knowledge involving the subject matter. And you have the ability to tell the entity to go away. This is where you get started. Now, there's another thing that needs to be mentioned here, and that there are some limits with this process. One, and this is the biggest one, is that it tends to only give you a good 10, maybe 15, maybe 5 years on the light end advantage on what's currently available in state of the art. Now, why is this? Well, here's the thing. If you're dealing with something physical or something mechanical, you need stuff to do it with. And if you're dealing with something that's more than 5 or 10 years out, the stuff to do it with may either not be available, or available at such a price point or rarity that it might as well not be available. A good example involves cell phones. If you look at a cell phone from 1995, and then you look at a cell phone from 2005, these are two radically different objects. The simple fact of the matter is, no matter what your level of technical skill and engineering was, or is, if it's 1995, the things you would need to build a 2005 era cell phone may simply not be available, or may be so hard to get that it's not practical to do. So another more mundane example is that of the microwave oven. The technology for building a microwave oven had been around since the 1940s, but the power supplies, the materials, and all the other things necessary to actually build a microwave oven that worked meant that you really only found these things in research facilities and hospitals well through the 1960s and early 1970s. Flash forward to the 1980s. Now, anybody could afford to buy a microwave oven if they weren't a little expensive. Flash forward again to the 2020s when I'm recording this video, and you can't even give a used microwave oven away because they're so inexpensive. So keep in mind there can very well be some very basic materials technology limitations regarding what you can actually do regardless of your knowledge base. So if you're trying to bring something into creation that on our timeline is more than 10 or 15 years out, it largely falls into the category of science fiction because you simply don't have the stuff to do it with. Now, if you'd like to learn more about this process or how all these things simply fit together, come over to SixtySkills.com, check out the blog, or if you'd like some coursework on this kind of thing, consider enrolling in either the Master Course or the Kabbalah course available at Perseus Arcane Academy. Otherwise, as per usual, train hard and be well.